Hi, welcome back to session 7 of the Style Sessions. I'm Roger Mittag, I'll be your host. Today we're going to deal with a really unique beer, and it's got lots of interesting characteristics and great history behind it. And the style that we're going to talk about is called a Rauchbier in German, or a smoke beer. And it's really important that you pronounce this correctly. So it's Rauch, R-A-U-C-H. If you say Rauch means intoxication in German, so it's not going to come across as what you're expecting. Smoke beer is fine, Rauch beer is great. So the one that we're going to feature is this one. This is from a brew pub in Bamberg called Schlenkerla. And on the label, it's written in Old German, but it says Echt Schlenkerla Rauchbier. Now, I'll give you a bit of the background in a second, but we're going to pour it as we always do first, and we'll talk about the beer itself, and then we'll get into some history. So I've picked a beer glass called the Prague, and the Prague has a really narrow waist, but it blossoms up at the top in the mouth, and that's to allow all the aromatics to come out a little bit more. So when you hold this beer up, it's going to be very similar, if not a little bit darker than Bock beers in our previous segment. So in this case, a little less red, a little bit more brown, and we're talking about chestnut brown with some, again, mahogany tones in there, but it's more of a reddish brown than anything else. The foam is still that cappuccino crema color, so that off-white, dark cream. It's a really neat looking beer. It's got a great foam. Foam retention in this particular glass is dropping a little bit, so it's important to try it. The cool thing about this is when you smell it, it's going to be intense. It's going to be big time smoke. To me, it reminds me of a campfire, it reminds me of barbecue, it reminds me of bacon. Incredible beer. So the things that you're going to smell, and first of all, Echt Schlenkerla Rauchbier is a Märzen. And a Märzen is also known as an Oktoberfest beers. These are beers that are produced in the winter months and released in March, which is März in German. So this is a Märzen style. So this is a lager, and it is a Rauch beer. So it's made with smoked malts. So you get all these really cool smells. I mean, there's a lot of things that this reminds you of. And you know, if you just talk about smoke, that's one thing, but it's hardwood smoke. It's like oak or maple. Smells like pulled pork, barbecue, ham, campfire. It's just really robust. So you're expecting some big, intense flavors out of it as well. So here's the thing. On your first sip, you're going to get a little bit of carbonation. You're going to get a ton of that smoky characteristic again. So it's blossoming out all this big smoke, hardwood smoke, bacon characteristics in there, smoked ham. It's got a quick finish because it's a lager, and then it's got a long smoky aftertaste. And really the biggest characteristics in this particular beer are the smoke. It's going to be really hard for you to pick up anything else. There's definitely no hop characteristics in this beer at all. Eventually, as it warms up, you'll start picking up caramel and toffee, but those are also typical things that we find when we barbecue meats. We find that caramelization of any sugars within the meats themselves create that caramel toffee characteristic as well. You're going to get some umami out of this, so some of that soy sauce characteristic that we would typically get. It's an amazing beer. I don't think it's one that you can drink a ton of, though. And I think for me, personally, I need to have this with food. One of the best pairings I ever did was a long time ago, and I did it with a bacon wrap scallop. And it was a big scallop, about that big around it, this bacon around it. And the interesting part was that the sweetness of the scallop actually took away some of the intensity of the smoke, while it matched in with the bacon, obviously. So let me give you a bit of history on the style first, and then Schlenkerla. So the style, there is some indication in some written documentation in Germany now that the first mention of smoke in beers goes back to around 1000 AD. Now, it's very likely that almost all beers were very smoky for a long period of time, because in order to use barley, you have to go through the malting process, and the last step in the malting process is called kilning, and that's where you roast it. So back in 1000 AD or in the Middle Ages, you wouldn't have had any controlled heating conditions. You would have been using open flame. And open flame often chars things, so you get this really intense smoky characteristic. This is the same kind of process that we see in Scotch whiskies that are using peat. So any Scotch whiskey that's maybe coming from Islay is using peat smoke to infiltrate into the grain itself. So that's where you're getting this smoky characteristic. And in particular in Bamberg, which is it's a UNESCO heritage site, but it's got the most breweries per capita of any city in Germany. It's a really fascinating, and smoke beers are renowned in that particular area and in the area just south, which is part of Franconia, which is now part of Bavaria. So smoke beers have been around there for a long period of time, and it was because we burnt it and we had this open flame and smoke. So enough said about that. So let's fast forward a few hundred years. Schlenkella is a brew pub, and we have to recognize that when the brew pub was first mentioned, it was 1405. That's probably where they were making the beer. Now it's made in a brewery, and so taverns and brew pubs would have made their own beer. And Schlenkella is a really, really interesting place because the term Schlenkella in German is slang for wobbly man. And when you open this beer and you take a look at the cap, you'll notice there's a man on the top with a cane who looks like he's moving back and forth. So history has it that we don't know whether the brewer was actually wobbling because he had difficulty walking because of the cane, or whether he was a brewer who had sampled one too many. We don't know. There's an interesting story that I can tell personally of my visit to Schlenkella. My wife and I went there quite a few years ago. We were in Germany visiting some relatives, and we decided to go to Bamberg. So we stopped into Schlenkella because I needed to go there. And we went in and we sat out in the beer garden, and it was an interesting experience because the server was rough around the edges. And she was barking across the beer garden. She was throwing coasters down. It seemed from a North American perspective that she was just rude. And then a few days later, we were taking a tour of the Weyermann malting facility in Bamberg. And the fellow that was giving us a tour asked us if we went to Schlenkella, and we said, yes, we did. And he said, were they rude? And we said, oh yeah, they were very rude. He goes, that's their thing. So when you go to Schlenkella, when you go to Bamberg, and I urge that you go to Bamberg because you'll have a fantastic experience, you go to Schlenkella, you should expect middle-aged kind of service and not the kind of politeness that you would normally get. It's a great experience. They have their beers on cask, so you're getting them really, really fresh. But when you go there, expect that you're going to get nothing but smoke beers. So that's our look at Rauchbiers. We see some smoke beers being produced locally by some craft brewers, and some people are using beechwood aging or beechwood to smoke. Some people are using peat. It really depends on the brewer themselves. Peat's got a lot more earthiness to it and less of that savory bacon characteristic. So I raise a glass of a German Rauchbier, Ex-Schlenkella Rauchbier, say Prosit, and I look forward to hosting you for our next session, which is going to be on Weissbiers.